Did you ever have to pretend everything was fine when it really wasn't?
Imagine sitting at a turkey-stuffed table in the heart of an Ohio suburb where the air hangs heavy with the mingled scents of overcooked bird, tart cranberry sauce that always seems to bite back just a little too sharply, as if mirroring the unspoken family tensions bubbling beneath the surface. And suddenly your own father locks eyes with you across the mismatched plates and linen napkins that have seen better holidays, his voice dropping into that gravelly timbre honed from decades on the factory floor before it all went sideways, declaring without a flicker of hesitation that you can either squeeze yourself into the cramped laundry room like some discarded household appliance gathering lint and regret, or pack your bags and leave the house for good. All while your brother Mark leans back in his chair with that infuriating smirk curling at the corners of his mouth as if he's just been handed the winning lottery ticket in a game you didn't even know you were playing, and in that suspended heartbeat where the clatter of silverware fades into a stunned hush, you realize with a gut-wrenching clarity that the very roof he's threatening to yank away from you has been propped up month after month by your own quiet sacrifices, the kind no one ever bothers to acknowledge until the foundations start to crack under the weight of their ingratitude. I remember every detail of that Thanksgiving dinner as if it were etched into the worn oak of our family table. The one Dad had sanded down himself back when he still fancied himself the handyman hero of our little world in this middle-class neighborhood, where houses like ours stood as symbols of stubborn endurance against the economic storms that had battered the Midwest for years. And as I sat there at 38 years old, my fork hovering midway between plate and mouth loaded with a bite of mashed potatoes swimming in too much gravy that tasted like comfort food turned obligatory ritual, I felt the heat creeping up my neck, not just from the embarrassment of being called out in front of Mom and the extended relatives who'd shown up with their polite smiles and covered dishes, but from the sheer absurdity of the ultimatum landing like a poorly wrapped present no one wanted to open. Especially since I'd been the one funneling chunks of my freelance graphic design income into the mortgage payments ever since Dad's layoff 8 years prior had turned our stable life into a precarious tightrope walkover. Foreclosure notices and whispered worries about losing the only home I'd ever known. Mark's smirk widened just a fraction as Dad's words settled over the room like a heavy fog, his eyes darting between me and the half-eaten drumstick on his plate as if he were calculating how this latest family drama might tip the scales in his favor yet again, the way it always seemed to for him ever since he dropped out of community college and started treating the house like an all-expenses-paid crash pad while bouncing between odd jobs that never quite stuck, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, that smug assurance born from years of coasting on the edges of everyone else's efforts without ever pitching in a dime or a day's real work. Mom shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fork scraping against the china in a nervous rhythm that betrayed her usual role as the peacemaker who smoothed over Dad's gruff outbursts with deflections about the weather or the latest neighborhood gossip. But this time even she couldn't muster more than a feeble murmur of protest that dissolved into the thickening silence, leaving me to absorb the blow alone as the weight of unappreciated loyalty pressed down harder than the full platter of pumpkin pie waiting untouched in the kitchen. Without a single word escaping my lips, because what could I possibly say in that moment to salvage the shreds of dignity still clinging to me like crumbs on a tablecloth, I set my fork down with a deliberate clink that reverberated through the room louder than any shout might have, the sound cutting through the pretense like a knife through overbaked rolls, and then I rose from my chair, shrugging into my coat from the hook by the door where it had hung innocently amid the scarves and mittens of familial normalcy, stepping out into the biting November chill that nipped at my skin and carried the faint echo of distant traffic from the highway that always reminded me of escape routes untaken. The screen door banged shut behind me with a finality that felt both liberating and heartbreaking, propelling me down the cracked driveway past the faded basketball hoop Mark had outgrown years ago and toward my car parked at the curb, where I slid behind the wheel and drove off into the gathering dusk without so much as a backward glance, the holiday lights twinkling mockingly from neighboring porches as if mocking the unraveling of my own family's facade. 2 days later, holed up in the spare room of my old college friend Sarah's apartment that carried the musty undertone of stored boxes and half-forgotten ambitions, I was sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug while scrolling through work emails on my laptop, trying to piece together the fragments of my disrupted life when my phone vibrated insistently on the nightstand, pulling me from the glow of the screen to reveal a text from Dad that landed like an aftershock in the quiet morning light. The simple message reading, "Camila, are you still paying the mortgage?" hitting me with the force of a revelation long overdue, because in that stark query illuminated against the bland wallpaper, I saw not just his potential forgetfulness clouded by age and denial, but the deeper truth of how he'd never fully grasped, or perhaps chosen to ignore, the lifeline I'd thrown them all those years ago when the recession clawed away at his pride and our security. Each payment deducted automatically from my account, a silent testament to my role as the unseen pillar holding up the walls of that house while I scrimped on my own dreams of stability and perhaps even a place to call fully mine. That text lingered on my screen as I set the phone down, my mind reeling back through the timeline of choices that had led to this precipice. From the day I'd first logged into the bank's portal and linked my details to theirs in a quiet act of desperation disguised as duty, skipping out on weekend getaways with friends or upgrading my ancient design software because every dollar counted toward keeping the lights on and the roof intact for a family that now viewed me as expendable baggage, rather than the steady force I'd become. In the hours that followed, as I paced the narrow confines of Sarah's guest space dodging piles of her crafting supplies that spoke to her own unfulfilled creative pursuits, I felt a spark of that old resentment ignite into something sharper, prompting me to open our family group chat where the post-holiday chatter from cousins about Black Friday deals and leftover recipes flowed like nothing had shattered, and with a wry internal chuckle at the pettiness of it all, I forwarded a cartoon I'd stumbled upon earlier depicting a flock of ungrateful turkeys plotting against the farmer who fed them, attaching no caption, but letting the image speak its subtle volumes as the read receipts trickled in one by one, marks popping up last and staying unread for an awkwardly long stretch that suggested he'd caught the pointed humor aimed squarely at his smirking entitlement. Yet, even as that small act of witty retaliation brought a fleeting sense of satisfaction warming through the chill of isolation, my phone rang once more that evening, the caller ID flashing Mark's name with an insistence that set my teeth on edge. And when I answered against my better judgment, his voice came through laced with a demanding edge wrapped in false familial concern, insisting I return home immediately to sort this out like adults, while his words carried an undercurrent of urgency that hinted at knowledge far deeper than he'd ever admitted, leaving me gripping the device tightly in the dim light and pondering just how much of my hidden burdens he had pieced together over the years. The uncertainty coiling tighter around me like a noose drawn from threads of betrayal and unspoken alliances that threatened to pull me back into the fray before I could even catch my breath. That insistent ring from Mark's call echoed in the stuffy confines of Sarah's spare room long after I'd hit end on the conversation, his demanding tone laced with that false urgency about family obligations pulling at the frayed edges of my resolve like a loose thread on an old sweater Mom had knitted back when life felt simpler and holidays didn't end in ultimatums that left you questioning every choice you'd made to keep the peace. And as I sank onto the lumpy futon that night with a faint hum of city traffic filtering through the thin walls, my mind inevitably wandered back to the summer 8 years earlier when the recession's grip had tightened around our family like a vice, squeezing out the last drops of financial security we'd clung to in our modest Ohio suburb where factory jobs vanished overnight, and dreams of retirement dissolved into endless job applications stacked like unpaid bills on the kitchen counter. Dad had always been the rock of our household, his broad shoulders from years on the assembly line carrying not just the weight of car parts, but the unspoken promise of stability that let Mom focus on her part-time shifts at the local library and me on scraping together my first freelance gigs after college. But one sweltering afternoon in July, he came home earlier than usual with a severance check clutched in his calloused hand and a defeated slump to his posture that made the whole house feel smaller, the air conditioner straining against the heat as he sat us down at the scarred wooden table to announce the plant's closure, his voice cracking just once when he admitted the mortgage would be the first casualty if things didn't turn around soon. leaving Mark and me exchanging glances that mixed shock with the dawning realization that our safety net had unraveled in an instant. In the chaotic weeks that followed, with Mom's overtime barely covering groceries and Dad's pride keeping him from unemployment lines he'd once mocked, I watched the red letter notices pile up in the mailbox like accusations of failure. Each one a stark reminder of how the American dream we'd been sold could crumble under economic pressures that hit hardest in heartland towns like ours where second chances came wrapped in debt and denial. And being the only one with a semi-steady income from designing logos for small businesses scattered across the Midwest, I found myself logging into the bank's website late one night after everyone had gone to bed, my laptop screen casting a blue glow over the cluttered desk in my old bedroom that still held posters from my high school days, and with a deep breath that tasted of resolve mixed with resentment, I linked my checking account to theirs for the mortgage autopay, framing it the next morning as a short-term bridge loan over breakfast of burnt toast and weak coffee so Dad wouldn't feel like he was handing over the reins entirely. From that point on, it became my invisible routine, every first of the month. Bringing the automated deduction that shaved a couple $100 from my budget for things like new art supplies or a decent haircut, forcing me to stretch ramen noodles and freelance hustle into something resembling adulthood, while back home, they carried on with the facade of normalcy. Dad tinkering in the garage as if the bills sorted themselves and Mark treating the basement like his personal kingdom of video games and half-hearted job hunts that never led anywhere substantial. Reflecting on it now from the borrowed anonymity of Sarah's place, with her cat eyeing me suspiciously from the windowsill, as if sensing the turmoil churning inside, I couldn't help but let out a dry chuckle at the irony of how I'd become the family's secret safety valve, pouring in effort without a whisper of thanks or even awareness from most of them, especially Mark, who lounged rent-free and contribution-free, his smirks over the years now retroactively tainted with the knowledge that he'd been freeloading off my sacrifices all along. The next day, fueled by that simmering mix of anger and absurd humor at the whole setup, like how Dad's text had basically asked if the tooth fairy was still visiting, I decided to test the waters with Mark directly, texting him a casual probe about whether he'd caught wind of the house finances lately, his reply coming back swift but evasive with a laughing emoji that did nothing to mask the pause before it, followed by a deflection about Dad's senior moments. That rang hollow even through the screen, and when I pressed further over a follow-up call during my lunch break hunched over a park bench with a stale sandwich, he finally cracked just enough to admit he'd overheard snippets of conversations about my help years back, but brushed it off as no big deal, since family sticks together, his voice dripping with that entitled nonchalance that made me want to reach through the phone and shake some accountability into him, though I held back, letting the silence stretch until he filled it with accusations of me being dramatic over Dad's dinner slip-up. Our exchange devolved into the familiar dance of sibling barbs, him jabbing at my single status, as if independence was a flaw, and me countering with veiled reminders of his perpetual couch-surfing phase that had stretched into adulthood. But beneath the words I sensed his deflection hiding a deeper unease, like he knew exposing my role would spotlight his own lack of contribution in a light too harsh for his comfort, and as we hung up with unresolved tension hanging between us, I felt a petty spark of revenge ignite, scrolling through Aunt Linda's social media feed where she perpetually fished for family updates amid her empty nest retirement phase, and with a quick, calculated comment on her post about the job market being tough these days, I tagged Mark while linking an article on entry-level factory openings at the very plant Dad had lost his spot in, phrasing it as, "Hey, thought this might help with fresh starts," in a tone dripping with faux helpfulness that ensured the relatives chimed in with encouraging replies. The subtle leak of his laziness circulating like gossip at a block party and leaving him to field the awkward follow-ups without me lifting another finger. That small act of witty exposure brought a rush of satisfaction as I imagined his face heating up over his phone, a clever payback that evened the score just a tad without descending into outright confrontation. Yet as the afternoon waned and I returned to Sarah's for another night of uneasy solitude, my phone lit up with a voicemail notification from Dad. his gravelly voice rougher than usual as he rambled about the bills starting to stack up again and the bank's nagging calls that had him pacing the living room floor, the worry threading through his words like a plea wrapped in confusion that tugged at the old loyalties I'd tried to sever, leaving me frozen in place with the device in hand and the growing dread that this financial house of cards was teetering closer to collapse than I'd ever allowed myself to admit. Dad's voicemail played on a loop in my mind during the drive through the rain-slicked streets of our old neighborhood the following afternoon. His gravelly pleas about the mounting bills and those insistent bank calls weaving through the rhythmic slap of wipers against the windshield like a persistent undercurrent of guilt that I couldn't quite shake despite the fresh resolve hardening in my chest after Mark's evasive deflections and my own small act of digital payback, pulling me inexorably back toward the family home under the pretense of checking in, but really driven by a gnawing need to unearth the layers of denial that had allowed this financial charade to fester for so long in the quiet corners of our suburban life, where appearances mattered more than admissions. The house loomed at the end of the cul-de-sac much as it always had, its faded blue siding and overgrown hedges a testament to the years of deferred maintenance I'd indirectly funded through those monthly deductions that now felt like chains rather than lifelines, and as I parked at the curb with the engine ticking cool in the damp air, I hesitated for a moment staring at the front door where holiday wreaths still dangled limply from the Thanksgiving fallout, wondering if crossing that threshold would drag me deeper into the web of secrets or finally grant the clarity to cut free from the expectations that had pinned me in place since the recession first exposed the cracks in our family's foundation. Letting myself in with the spare key that felt heavier in my palm than it ever had before, the familiar creak of the floorboards greeted me like an old acquaintance reluctant to reveal its grudges. The living room dim with drawn curtains and the faint scent of Mom's lavender air freshener doing little to mask the underlying staleness of unspoken worries that had built up over months of avoided conversations about money and mortality in a household where Dad's pride had always been the unyielding boss. Mom was in the kitchen stirring a pot of soup that bubbled softly on the stove, her face lighting up with a mix of relief and apprehension as she wiped her hands on her apron and pulled me into an embrace that carried the warmth of chamomile tea and the subtle tremor of someone carrying too many burdens alone. Confessing over mugs of the steaming broth at the scarred breakfast nook how Dad's recent stroke, minor, he'd insisted, but enough to fog his memory like morning mist over the neighborhood lake, had amplified his stubborn refusal to acknowledge the help I'd provided, turning what should have been a temporary fix into a silent expectation that left her walking on eggshells between his outbursts and Mark's increasingly bold ideas about reshaping their future without consulting anyone. We talked in that hushed, confiding way that skipped over the surface pleasantries straight to the heart of it, her admitting she'd pieced together my role in the payments from glimpsed bank statements and overheard phone calls, but had stayed silent to preserve the fragile piece Dad clung to like a life raft in choppy economic waters, a choice that mirrored my own hesitations and made me question in that moment why we'd both enabled the denial for so long, allowing resentment to simmer beneath the daily routines of grocery runs and garden tending in this middle-class enclave where neighbors envied our outward stability without suspecting the invisible scaffolding I'd erected. Emboldened by her vulnerability, I ventured upstairs to Dad's study, the room cluttered with stacks of yellowed newspapers chronicling factory closures and job fairs from the recession era. And there amid the dust motes dancing in the slanted light from the window, I discovered the shoebox tucked behind a row of forgotten tax manuals, its lid warped from humidity and contents spilling slightly with envelopes marked in red ink from the bank, each one a chronological map of the debts that had mounted before my intervention, including a particularly damning note in Dad's handwriting referencing a talk with Mark about Camila's quiet contributions. That proved my brother hadn't been the oblivious slacker I'd painted him as, but rather someone who'd known enough to leverage the information for his own ease, coasting on my efforts while flashing that smirk to mask his complicity in the family's quiet exploitation. The discovery hit like a cold splash of reality amid the musty air, twisting my anger into a dilemma that pinned me in place. Should I confront them all with this evidence and shatter the illusions we'd built, or hold it close as ammunition for the revenge brewing in my thoughts? a path that felt both empowering and perilously close to the very secrecy I'd resented for years, making me wonder if my reluctance to blow it open stemmed from lingering love or just the fear of becoming the villain in their narrative of hard-knock endurance. Downstairs, as Mom and I wrapped up our talk with promises to loop Dad in gently once his headache eased, Mark texted with his usual blend of bluster and bait, complaining about the fallout from Aunt Linda's post that had led to awkward questions at his latest dead-end interview and demanding I back off the meddling, his words laced with that entitled whine that grated like sandpaper on my frayed nerves. And in a flash of witty retaliation born from the letter still burning in my mind, I crafted a fake utility bill on my phone's editing app, exaggerating the amounts just enough to mimic the real ones I'd seen, and emailed it to him anonymously from a throwaway account with a note about overdue family shares. The clever forgery designed to spook him into sweating over his own precarious position without revealing my hand, a satisfying jab that left me stifling a chuckle at the absurdity of playing these games in our 40s while he stewed on the other end. Yet as the afternoon light faded into evening and I prepared to leave with the weight of those letters tucked into my bag like contraband, a plain brown package waited unassumingly on the front porch addressed to me in blocky handwriting that matched no one I knew, its contents spilling open slightly to reveal a sheaf of recent mortgage documents stamped with urgent notices and highlighted discrepancies that screamed of deeper troubles brewing. The mysterious delivery hanging in the air like a question mark as I clutched it tightly and scanned the empty street, heart pounding with a sudden certainty that someone, perhaps the bank itself or a family insider with their own agenda, was thrusting me back into the fray just when I'd started to glimpse the exit. The mysterious package from the porch weighed down my passenger seat like an unwelcome passenger during the tense drive back to Sarah's apartment that evening, its contents of highlighted mortgage statements fluttering slightly with every bump in the road as if whispering accusations about the tangled web of finances I'd woven into our family's survival without ever demanding the recognition that might have prevented this slow unraveling of trust and loyalty in the quiet suburbs where secrets festered behind closed doors and manicured lawns, forcing me to pull over at a gas station under the harsh fluorescent lights to sift through the papers more carefully, my fingers tracing the urgent stamps and overdue balances that painted a picture far grimmer than Dad's vague voicemail had suggested, hinting at months of lapsed payments I'd somehow missed amid my own freelance deadlines and the emotional fallout from Thanksgiving. Back at Sarah's, with her offering sympathetic nods over takeout pizza that tasted like cardboard in my distracted state, I pieced together the implications during a late-night call to Mom, her voice hushed as if Dad might overhear from the next room despite his early bedtime routine altered by the stroke's lingering fatigue. And she finally confessed the full extent of Mark's underhanded maneuvering, explaining how he'd been secretly consulting a real estate agent about listing the house for a quick sale to cash in on whatever equity remained after the recession's long shadow had eroded property values in our neighborhood of aging split levels and fading American flags. The revelation twisted like a knife in my gut, not just because it betrayed the very home I'd bled money into for years, but because it exposed Mark's calculation in a new light, his knowledge of my contributions, gleaned from those faded letters and casual eavesdropping, now fueling a scheme to flip the asset for his personal gain, pocketing a chunk to fund some vague entrepreneurial dream he'd peddled to relatives at barbecues while leaving Mom and Dad to scramble for affordable rentals in a market that chewed up seniors like yesterday's news. We arranged to meet the next morning at the local diner with its sticky booths and bottomless coffee that always carried a hint of burnt grounds, mirroring the scorched earth feel of our conversations, where Mom slid across the laminated table a crumpled flyer bearing the agent's glossy photo and Mark's contact details scrawled in the margin, the proposed listing price a slap in the face given how my payments had staved off total loss. And as we huddled over the document amid the clatter of plates from nearby booths filled with retirees swapping stories of fixed incomes and rising costs, I felt a surge of that familiar resentment laced with a bitter humor at the audacity of it all. Like Mark viewing the house as his personal ATM after years of contributing nothing beyond his smirks and sporadic lawn mowing that never quite measured up. The health twist deepened the dilemma when Mom's phone buzzed mid-discussion with a call from Dad's doctor, patching her through to confirm that while the stroke was stable, his blood pressure spikes from financial stress could tip into something more serious if the uncertainty persisted, the medical jargon filtering through like a warning siren that pulled at my heartstrings in ways that made me question my hardening stance. Because despite the ultimatum and the ingratitude, he was still the father who'd coached my little league team and fixed my first flat tire, a soft spot that now felt like a vulnerability even as it urged me toward a family meeting to hash things out before Mark's plan gained irreversible momentum. Mark arrived at the house later that afternoon with his usual swagger masking the sweat beading on his forehead from the realtor's recent hesitations, the air in the living room thick with the scent of Dad's aftershave and the tension of unspoken accusations as we circled the coffee table strewn with the incriminating flyer and my printed payment history. His defenses flying up immediately with claims that selling was a mercy move to lighten their load in retirement years strained by healthcare bills and a shrinking Social Security check that barely covered basics in this economy of endless inflation. I held my ground, laying out the math of my 8-year investment in calm, measured tones that belied the storm inside, watching his eyes flicker to the documents with a mix of defiance and dawning discomfort. But the real revenge brewed in the quiet hours before as I'd reached out to a contact from my design network who moonlighted as a title searcher, casually inquiring about Mark's side hustle of flipping salvaged cars from online auctions, and with a few pointed questions about registration. Discrepancies I'd recalled from family dinners where he'd bragged too loudly. I prompted an anonymous flag to the DMV that stalled his latest deal just enough to echo back through the agent's channels during our standoff, the witty sabotage unfolding via a follow-up email to the realtor citing compliance issues without naming names, leaving Mark's face drain of color as his phone lit up with bad news and the meeting teetered on the edge of chaos. That clever hit brought a fleeting thrill of justice amid the arguments that escalated into shouts about fairness and favoritism, Dad chiming in weakly from his recliner with pleas for unity that tugged at my resolve despite the audience in my mind. Yours perhaps too, whispering that my lingering empathy for him bordered on foolish indulgence after all the slights. Yet as the session broke with no resolution and promises of cooling off, my phone vibrated later that night with a voicemail from Dad himself, his voice cracking through the static like fragile glass on the verge of shattering as he begged me to come back home right away and talk it through one more time, the raw vulnerability in his words wrapping around my uncertainties and drawing me inexorably toward the confrontation I both dreaded and craved. Dad's voicemail replayed in my ears like a haunting refrain during the solitary drive back to the family home the next morning, his cracked voice pleading for one more chance to talk it through, weaving through the rustle of autumn leaves skittering across the highway and stirring up a whirlwind of conflicting emotions that had me gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary as if to anchor myself against the pull of old loyalties clashing with the fresh scars from Mark's schemes and the mortgage papers that still cluttered my glove compartment like unanswered indictments in this ongoing saga of hidden sacrifices and belated realizations. The house appeared much as it had in my childhood memories, its porch light flickering weakly in the overcast daylight and the front yard dotted with the remnants of holiday decorations that no one had bothered to fully dismantle after the Thanksgiving debacle, but stepping inside now carried a different weight, the air thick with the mingled aromas of Mom's fresh-baked bread attempting to soothe the undercurrent of dread, and the faint medicinal tang from Dad's recent prescriptions that underscored how fragile the foundations had become in our once sturdy suburban refuge where economic hardships had chipped away at more than just the paint. Mom met me at the door with eyes red-rimmed from a night of worry, drawing me into the kitchen where Dad sat slumped in his armchair pulled up to the table like a sentinel guarding his pride, his hands clasped around a mug of cooling coffee that trembled slightly from the stroke's aftereffects. And as we settled into an uneasy circle with Mark bursting through the back door moments later, his face a storm cloud of frustration from the stalled real estate deal that my anonymous tip had derailed. The room hummed with the pent-up energy of revelations long overdue, each of us glancing at the stack of documents I'd brought as props that laid bare the 8 years of my financial tethering in Stark black and white printouts from bank portals and faded receipts tucked away in desk drawers. I started the confrontation with a steady recounting of it all, my voice cutting through the initial awkward silences as I detailed the $24,000 siphoned from my freelance earnings to cover those monthly payments, starting from the recession's brutal layoff that had left Dad adrift and the family teetering on the edge of eviction notices piling up like autumn debris, explaining how I'd skipped personal milestones like vacations to warmer climates or even a reliable car upgrade to ensure their lights stayed on and the roof held firm against Midwest winters, all while they navigated life with the illusion of self-sufficiency that now crumbled under the weight of my words. Dad's expression shifting from confusion to a dawning shame that etched deeper lines into his weathered face as he mumbled fragmented apologies laced with admissions of suspected knowledge buried under layers of denial and the fog of his health decline. Mark's reaction erupted like a long-simmering pot boiling over, his accusations flying hot and heavy about me hoarding the narrative to paint him as the villain in this family drama when in truth he'd only been trying to secure a future for everyone amid the crushing realities of aging parents and stagnant wages in a town where opportunities dried up faster than creek beds in summer drought. But the real twist sliced through the chaos when Mom, her voice steady for the first time in days, produced an old laptop from the sideboard and opened an email chain buried in her archives that none of us had revisited. The messages dating back 5 years revealing Mark's explicit confessions to Dad about overhearing my bank alerts during late-night visits and subsequently using that intel to negotiate his own extensions on rent-free living with promises of eventual payback that never materialized, transforming him in my eyes from unwitting freeloader to deliberate opportunist whose smirks had masked a calculated exploitation of my goodwill, a betrayal that made my past choices to remain silent feel like self-inflicted wounds born from a misguided hope that family bonds could weather any storm without the harsh light of accountability. The audience within me, and perhaps you listening along, might have recoiled at that point, questioning why I'd tolerated the imbalance for so long, enabling the very dynamics that led to Dad's ultimatum and Mark's schemes through my hesitance to demand reciprocity in a household where gender roles still lingered like outdated wallpaper. Women like Mom and me picking up the emotional and financial slack, while the men clung to facades of provision, a dilemma that now fueled the ultimate revenge brewing in my thoughts as the arguments tapered into exhausted pauses broken only by the tick of the wall clock marking time we'd wasted in avoidance. With a deliberate calm that belied the adrenaline surging through me, I pulled out my phone and logged into the mortgage portal right there at the table under their watchful eyes, transferring the account ownership back to Dad's name with a series of clicks that echoed like final judgments in the quiet kitchen, but not before activating a discreet auto-alert system routed through a secondary email that would notify me of any missed payments or irregularities without obligating my involvement. A clever financial maneuver that handed them the reins while keeping a watchful thread in my grasp, ensuring they'd feel the full weight of responsibility without my direct support and allowing me to step back empowered yet informed. The witty safeguard satisfying in its subtlety as Mark's protests died on his lips and Dad nodded with a mix of gratitude and trepidation that hinted at the hard lessons ahead. As the dust settled amid awkward embraces and tentative promises of change whispered like fragile truces over cooling mugs of tea, I gathered my things and walked out into the crisp afternoon air that carried the scent of impending rain and distant wood smoke from neighborhood fireplaces, feeling an unaccustomed lightness in my step tempered by the haunting pull of those enduring ties that had shaped me even as they'd strained my limits. The original text from Dad now resonating as a pivotal question mark in the narrative of our fractured bonds, leaving me to drive away with the house shrinking in the rearview mirror and a lingering ambiguity about whether I'd truly severed the debts, financial or familial, or merely paused them long enough to breathe, pondering in the quiet miles ahead if such entanglements ever resolve cleanly or simply evolve into new forms of quiet endurance.